Let's go to Ayman Mohyeldin from Tel Aviv.
This will be interesting.
Ayman, a lot of angles to go on, but let's start with the reaction you're following in Egypt. We just talked about the president of Egypt, but in Egypt about the printing of the new issue of Charlie Hebdo. What are they saying?
Yeah, I was just hearing that conversation, but yesterday, late in the evening, one of the major religious authorities there, a body that effectively issues edicts to the citizens, Muslim citizens of Egypt, condemned the new issue that was coming out with the caricature of the Prophet Muhammad on it, saying that it's going to further add to a conflict of cultures between the West and the Muslim world. It essentially denounced this new magazine, saying that it was also going to increase discrimination against Muslims in Europe and that it was not productive to relationships between the two people. It totally condemned the violence. It did not whatsoever call for any violence. And in fact, last week it condemned the attack on the magazine, but it said this new issue was not productive, was not helpful to the overall goal that people are trying to do. And also coincidentally on that point, not from a religious authority, but also from the Iranian foreign minister, a political figure. We heard from him just moments ago, just before his meeting with Secretary of State John Kerry, and he too has come out saying that the new issue of Charlie Hebdo was, again, counterproductive, was not going to help in what people are trying to do, and that this doesn't further dialogue between cultures and civilizations, guys. Also with us from Paris, we've got NBC News chief global correspondent Bill Neely. Bill, what's the latest?
Well, the latest from Paris is that this magazine, which was in financial difficulties, which sold 50,000 copies on a good week, is now stronger than ever. This is the magazine that sold like hotcakes here. 3 million copies printed and sold within hours. 2 million more copies now being ordered in numerous languages. You know, guys, it's almost as if people here are buying it as a statement. They hadn't bought it before, but they want to show their solidarity, not just with the magazine, but stand up for free speech. So this magazine today in Paris, very hard to find.
You know, it's fascinating. There's so many times, Bill Crystal, that United States foreign policy is accused of doing something counterproductive that actually strengthens our enemies. These two terrorists, by gunning down this magazine, brought to the attention literally hundreds of millions of people across the world who had never heard of the magazine before. I had never heard of this magazine before.
Let's hope they don't succeed in intimidating media, though. Look, the Iranian foreign minister condemning Charlie Hebdo, that's rich. Iran began this business of not just you can, in your own country, prevent the publication of cartoons satirizing the Prophet Muhammad. That's understandable in the Islamic Republic of Iran or in other Islamic countries. But Iran began the business in 1989 of deciding that they could issue a fatwa, which Khomeini did, against Salman Rushdie for publishing a book in another country, and indeed people were killed by Iranian agents or Iranian-inspired terrorists who were publishers and translators of Rushdie. And that's what this is unbelievable. It's not one thing for them to have different views of free speech and of blasphemy within their country. They're trying to export that to the West. And the question for the West is, it's very nice to buy 3 million copies of Charlie Hebdo. It's nice to have that demonstration Sunday. But does the West have the spirit and the guts not to censor itself now? There's to say, oh, well, we could barely mention the word Catholic. They're just these people who've been taking advantage in a horrible way of little boys or little girls. And sort of by accident, a few of them might be in that. No, people started making judgments about celibacy, about the Catholic Church, about the governance of the Catholic Church, and then people debated it, and that's fine. But you really can't get in the business. This is where political correctness goes from being just kind of silly and embarrassing to dangerous, I think.
Bill Neely, let me bring you in. You want to talk? We've got a couple other. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, just to back up what Bill Crystal was saying, I was in Iran a few years ago, and the main state-run newspaper shows the crudest anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic cartoons, things that would make the staff of Charlie Hebdo blush. So as Bill says, it's a bit rich for the Iranian foreign minister to be saying that this latest cover is a little bit unhelpful. Sorry.
Harold Ford.
Interesting.
So I hear you. So the question I have, do you think there's some news networks that won't show the cover and won't talk about this? Do you think that's appropriate? Or I happen to think it's wrong. But is there a legitimate conversation that should take place around what's appropriate, what's not.
Like with the weekly
we
standard.
Did show, we showed the cartoons on our website, so we produced one of them here. After the act of terror, which was precipitated by those cartoons, it was an act of killing and revenge against the people who drew and published those cartoons. I think, A, it's part of the news story, and B, I felt personally, as an act of sort of solidarity, you should print them once. Now, if cartoons are just randomly printed somewhere and you don't think they're in good taste or terribly funny, don't print them. That's obviously, you can do what you want. But once journalists are killed for printing these cartoons, I think real solidarity is at least to show that you're not scared to print them once.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Ayman, talk about the divide in the Muslim world, obviously, and in the West, and who you see in the Middle East, who you see in the Muslim world trying to bridge that divide.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, one of the points that you guys were talking about, I think this is a very important point, is that a lot of people in the Muslim world use the word Muslim extremism, and they also use the word jihadist groups to refer to that. The word itself has been co-opted, no doubt about it, but right now there are people who speak out, and they definitely use the word extremism, radicalism. Those are not words that are taboo to use in the Arab world. So I know you guys were discussing that earlier, why the White House is reluctant to say that, but I also think about a point that Dr. Brzezinski said last week when he was on the show, when he was saying that you don't want to see yourself at a war with Islam. You don't want to drag 1.6 billion people into a confrontation. Right. There could be some of those sensitivities as well. But in terms of what actually happens from a religious point of view, in terms of this ongoing debate, you guys were talking about this, and it's very important. The Islamic world does not really have, on large, I mean, there's two major, obviously, groupings, the Sunni world and the Shia world. From the Sunni world, which is the predominant one, the only single body that really issues these kinds of respected fatwas or religious rulings is Al-Azhar University in Cairo. Now, every country has its own system, but that main institution issues those verdicts. Now, in recent months and in years, it has become more moderate. It generally has been a source of tremendous enlightenment, tremendous education. Right. You'll be surprised at some of the fatwas and rulings it has made over the years. But this debate right now, unfortunately, falls into a bigger problem that we've talked about on the show many times, that has to do more with freedom and the ability for people in general to interpret and to express their freedom, and that just simply doesn't happen in the Arab world.
Yeah, really quickly, Ayman, you said something last week, I think, during this discussion that I found absolutely fascinating. You were talking about Islamic extremism and specifically Saudi Arabia's part in funding, promoting, exporting this brand of the most extreme brand of Muslim extremism. Could you talk about that and how significant Saudi Arabia's role has been over the past quarter century?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it served several purposes, but in short, Saudi Arabia and the founders of that country have subscribed to a version of Islam known as Wahhabism. That's named after a person from Saudi Arabia and his interpretation of it. But it was the cornerstone of that country's religious interpretation of Islam that it began to export through a lot of different programs. I mean, even in the 1980s, when the United States and Saudi Arabia were fighting the Russians in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia was very fundamental in recruiting people to go and fight in Afghanistan. Part of that was based on using this interpretation of Islam as a way to recruit individuals from around the world to come and be a part of something bigger. When that war was over, Saudi Arabia continued to export that ideology through all kinds of programs, whether it was educational programs, it's health clinics that established across the developing world. And so more and more, and certainly now with the internet, the globalization of that interpretation has become a major point of concern. There isn't enough forces there aren't enough forces to counter that interpretation in some parts of the Arab and Muslim world, and that's why it is still a predominant form of that militant interpretation of Islam. A very important word here, a militant interpretation of Islam.
Exactly.
Ayman, thank you very much, and Bill Neely, thank you as well.